there's an area of opportunity that we withhold, it's actually not kind at all. And many people are hoping to be better people every single day. They're working on whatever they're working on personally and professionally, and we may know those goals and we may not, but they are hoping to improve. And so by giving them the benefit of the doubt and demonstrating our faith in them, it's almost like an indirect way of saying, hey, I recognize that you're a person who can grow and would want to grow. So here's something I'm noticing that would actually make your life and then the team's functionality better. Can we talk about this thing? If we could say it with that sort of essence, I think that it would dismantle some of the fear going into those conversations.
Hey there, dental economist. If you're a dentist owner or a leader within a dental business thinking about growing production, case acceptance, patient and staff satisfaction, positive outcomes, and everything else that comes with running a dental business, then you're a dental economist, and you've come to the right place. Welcome to the Dental Economist Show. We're meeting at the intersection of profit and purpose as I sit down with dental leaders who share their stories about dentistry, business, and growth. Welcome back to the Dental Economist Show with me, Mike Huffaker. Today, we're talking with Chelsea Myers, founder and CEO of Dental Life Coach, where she helps professionals and practices on a cultural level, helping to increase growth and patient retention. She's also the host of Dental Brain Crops, a podcast all about having an entrepreneurial mindset. Welcome to the show, Chelsea. How are you?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you. I wanted to start with a definition that you've coined as part of your business. Can you talk a little bit about what is a fractional CEO?
So I call myself the Chief Emotional Experience Officer because there's all of this focus on retention. And what I have found is that for organizations, our key players are our clients, right? And so what we've designed is an experience for people that immediately affirms their decision to join us and proactively supports them as they weave into our systems. And that way we can get off to a really solid start. But one of the things that I see a lot of is this missing component where we successfully attract the people that we want in our organizations and maybe have some cool things in place like techs and perks and all kinds of things that we're offering. But we aren't effectively supporting that emotional experience and partnering with us. And anybody listening can kind of self-diagnose. If retention is an issue in your organization, then it's an issue. And one thing that we can do is talk to people, invite them to talk in a free, open space about what they like, what they don't like. And oftentimes what I find is that there are things that can be adjusted to at least calm the waters a little bit. And sometimes it's not as complicated as we might think. Minor changes like how someone likes to be approached or words and phrases that land better. These are all things that are coming up in my conversations with key players in these organizations. And so we have the emotional experience cycle, which is actually broken down into 6 phases. And if we are aware of these phases that our key players are going to go through and strategically managing touches and supports throughout that experience, we can really impact their perception of our organization, which I say we have about 120 days, not always 120 days, but we have about 120 days to really make that good first impression that has everything to do with the longevity of those people in our organization.
Do you think that leaders within organizations sometimes seek to avoid having those conversations, like the open conversations and a safe place hearing about concerns and challenges that people on their team are having? Do some people shy away from that because they're almost afraid of what they're going to hear? And is it a challenge to create buy-in with the leaders that you work with to embrace that type of approach?
Yeah, that's an interesting conversation. So, first of all, I want to say that, in my opinion, we're in an industry of incredibly great people. In general, I think we all have really good goals and they're really similar goals, but what can happen is that there's sometimes a difference between how our leaders leading the organization and our key players in the organization think about those goals. And so when I say key player, I might, these might be our regionals or our clinicians, how we're thinking about those goals, and it has unnecessary consequences. And so, yeah, sometimes there are some avoidance behaviors going on. Other times, It's more of a language barrier, Mike, is what I'm seeing. The organization's saying this, the doctors are saying that, and everybody thinks they're being clear and they're not. And so one of the things that I like to do as much as possible is try to cut through some of that noise, especially around topics that have a tendency to be opinionated, like culture. And if there's something that I can share to help cut through that complexity of those dynamics, which ultimately will help impact the growth and profitability of our businesses, then I like to share. So yeah, I think there's the language barrier. And then other times there are some fears, but on both sides, right? If I'm in the organization, if we have this conversation, am I going to be hit with 3,000 demands that I actually can't accommodate? And then on the doctor side, there's a lot of avoidance tactics there as well. Some of the things that we even coach on, one of my most commonly requested topics is how to have a difficult conversation or a courageous conversation just to advocate for themselves.
I want to take one quick step back. I know we dove right into it. Can you talk through a little bit about how you became a coach? And it's fascinating to me because I think if I look through my career progression in my 20s, I had no knowledge that maybe I would even need coaching. It was just kind of like where I was at the time and whatever was delivered to me within the organizations that I was involved in. In my 30s, my ego almost would get in the way where I thought I probably knew more than I did. And that probably still happens. And it was like, hey, coaching might be a sign of weakness, or it would be me saying like that I'm not good enough. And so I'm asking somebody else to come in and like, I'm not open to that. And then as I've gotten kind of late 30s, I'm going to turn 45 this year. I love coaching and the concept of coaching and can really appreciate the importance of it and recognize that it is by no means a sign of weakness. In fact, asking for help is a strength. And if you could just walk through a little bit of your professional journey, and you've been coaching for many years now, what brought you to that? And what got you to the point where you said, like, yes, this is something I can do, and this is what I'm going to pursue?
Life is a constant self-discovery process, right? And so I've always known that I've had a knack for and been told that I have a gift for connecting with people and creating instant rapport and creating trust. And because of that, I've had the fortunate experience of having some really wonderful friendships, some of which are really long-term, some are new, and they're also just as deep and fulfilling. So that's always been a strength and an interest of mine, is knowing people and connecting with people and supporting where I can offer support and guidance. But, I grew up a really self-conscious and insecure person, and I was constantly seeking outside of myself for validation that I was worthy and worthy of love and worthy of being in a group setting and feeling comfortable in my own skin. That was something that was totally unfamiliar to me because I just didn't feel like I ever measured up. And I had a lot of reminders, external reminders that I wasn't measuring up. And so I found myself seeking, trying to get good grades or trying to seek his or her approval or trying to do the thing that would get me a pat on the back. And those are really short-lived forms of gratification. And so in my teens, I started dabbling with some drugs and alcohol. And that seemed to be a short-term solve. And then when my dad unexpectedly passed away when I was 16, I did what any person who was already dabbling in those things would do. And I went all in. And as you can expect, it's not a sustainable solution. So I was like 16 years old, found myself in rehab. And I remember we were sitting in a group setting. It was a family day. So they brought the parents in, and so you had the parents and all of these kids, 12 to 17 years old. And the facilitator asked the question, I think what all of the parents want to know here is why you guys ever turned to drugs or alcohol. What made you do that for the first time? Why would you do that? And all the parents are like, yeah, we raised you right. You had supports. You had all the things that we were trying to give you. Why did you do that? And I raised my hand and I'm like, I really think that's irrelevant. I think the more relevant question is, why did we do it the second time? What did that solve for us that was such a relief or such an enlightening experience that we wanted to do that again? And all the parents were like, no, 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 we want to go back to question number one. This is about us and our pain and our suffering. And I'm like, okay. But anyways, fast forward, I ended up, having some really great resources in place for me. And I was able to get out of that situation successfully. But those lessons were really monumental for me, recognizing that people do what they do for a reason. And it may not be where they want to stay, and there's lots of room to grow from there. But people have reasons for the ways that they are and the things that they're doing, even when they're not what we prefer. And so when I took my first job at Wells Fargo Bank, I was super excited, got my first job. I wasn't even out of college yet, but I was studying business finance. And within 2 weeks, my position was eliminated. So Wells was gracious and they were like, hey, you get to choose one of these three teams. Which one is most of interest to you? So I looked around, Mike, and I was like, I picked the team that seemed the nicest. That was that was my decision making factor. I'm like, I think I get that project. I think I'll work with that team. And they were really nice. And they also had been doing their jobs about as long as I'd been alive. And they didn't love that my position was to change a lot of things, including implementing tech and changing up systems and processes that had been up to that point very successful in their minds. And so I was getting a lot of resistance, to say the least, actually. And I found myself going home like, what am I going to do here? I've got this job. I think it makes sense to me. But because of my prior experience and because of just that desire to connect with people and understand, when I looked in their eyes, I recognized that their opposition was coming from fear. Is this going to displace me? How is this going to impact me? Am I going to be able to keep up? So rather than taking it super personally, I found myself going back to supports and books and resources that had been helpful to me. And the project was a huge success. It took about a year, and we were able to get some things in place that really changed that department. And at the close of it, a manager we shared the floor with approached me and he was like, Chelsea, you got to know what you were doing with that team. Quite honestly, we all expected you to fail. And he's like, but I need to be able to manage change the way you did. Can you talk me through that? So I did. I shared with him what I'd done. And he's like, you've got to meet this dentist friend of mine. He's talking about hiring a consultant. And I really think this is what he needs. So I did. I coached his friend, and that was a fantastic introduction to this beautiful industry, which I did not jump head first or, both feet at the same time. I dipped my toe in the water while taking on a project in public education, building out a program for autism. But when I came back from Europe, I got to go out there and, present our research and results and all the great things we were doing in North Texas. I found myself wondering, okay, what do I want to do next? And I really wanted to be in dental. And so I did some research, contacted a guy named Brian Kaleo that we all know. And he's like, well, here's how that works. And so I partnered in some practices. And what was cool about that, Mike, was I had already been coaching, doctors here and there. And then I had some just friends and in our network and community. But being able to see how my theories and my teachings were implemented, and then also seeing what else might be needed and, getting to experience the perspectives from people that, I had a vested interest in making this work now. That was really valuable experience for me. So that was how I got into it.
Most paths are not linear. So you set out on your own and you launched this consulting coaching business. You hear a lot about imposter syndrome and people that fear like, hey, I'm not really where I'm supposed to be. I'm not qualified for this role. Did you go through any of that when you were first launching your business? You're taking this risk, you're doing something that maybe you hadn't done a lot of before and learning a bit as you go, as we all do. How did you manage that? Or was it even an issue?
Mike, I have it today. And it's so funny you bring this up because I was just talking. I'm a member of this networking group, a networking group that I invest to be a part of, right? And even there, I was talking with the founder of that group, and we were talking about imposter syndrome and how it shows up even today. And I'm like, I invest to have a seat at this table. And there are still times where I find myself back at that 10-year-old version of myself going, should I speak up or should I just stay really quiet? Because so far they like me, but ultimately, I think this is all just curriculum. If we can look at it that way, that's kind of where I come back to. And if what I have to say, if one of your listeners, one out of all of them, here's one thing that sparks an idea or gives a different perspective that helps them, man, that was so worth it, because I think the connection and the contribution is just so much more important than what I think of that experience or my ego getting in the way.
Right. So part of it is just getting out of your own way and recognizing the benefit that's being provided and focusing on that versus focusing on the negative self-thoughts and doubts that can present themselves. I think that's fantastic. We talked earlier, and I switched the topic, but you had gotten into having hard conversations. I think you worded it in a little bit of a different way, but it's something I've been putting a lot of thought into over the past few months. Is like one of the differentiators between somebody that can be a great leader and somebody that is just okay at it, or maybe even worse, not a good leader. And that is their ability to not avoid hard conversations and to be able to have them gracefully. And I'm sorry, you used a different terminology for it, and so I'll let you speak through that. But I'm just kind of curious if you could maybe share some tactical advice for how folks in leadership roles should approach those situations.
There's the whole mindset piece. First of all, just selecting your timing, right? I'm not going into when you're heated and having a mutually beneficial end goal in mind. I think those things all help prep the energy going into that conversation. But I actually have something, and if anybody listening wants to, just shoot me an email, or it may even be on the website. But I have a really great framework for constructing a courageous conversation or a professional conversation, a difficult conversation, depends on who you're talking to.
And I'm sorry, what's your email address?
My email is Chelsea, Chelsea, at dentallife.coach, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Chelsea Myers. But I break it down into 3 steps. And so what I do is first approach the person and confess or disclose how you feel going into the conversation. And the reason we want to do that is it really humanizes the experience. Instead of me coming to you, I'm now leveling with you and I'm saying, hey, I've got some feelings too. I'm a human too. Here's how I'm feeling. So I might come to you and be like, hey, Mike, there's something on my mind and I'm a little worried about bringing this up, but I do think it's something worth discussing. Is now a good time for you? Okay, so confess or disclose how you're feeling, and then share step 2, what you are concerned that person might think, say, or do. So, in sharing this, I'm worried you're going to become offended, and that's not my intention. The reason this step 2 is so important is because it also demonstrates a consideration and thoughtfulness towards the listener. And it also provides you the opportunity to reaffirm what your goal is. So if I'm not wanting to offend you, my goal is I can create some understanding and maybe we can have a conversation about this and just share perspectives. My goal is not to offend you. And then the third step is to say it with room for another perspective. And this is where a lot of people accidentally trip themselves because, particularly if we feel like we've poked holes in the whole thing and we're just sure that our conclusion's correct, if you come out swinging that way, it's usually not well received. So even if we're sure it's correct, even if we're sure there's no other perspective here, saying it as if there might be, what I often find, I do this even in my own home with I do this with my husband and I'm getting better at it. I'm sure I can still get better at it. But sometimes I find, gosh, even with a person that I know so well, that I talk to every single day, that I think I know how he's thinking at all times, there's a missing component that changes the whole thing. So surely in a work environment, that exists.
You've clearly done this before, and that's really good advice and a really great approach. And the part about expressing the feeling from the get-go, I think, is where a lot of people really miss. You feel like if you're coming into this, and as you put it, like from here down to here, it should be on the same level. And there's no shame in saying, like, this is a really hard conversation for me to have. This is a difficult topic that we need to discuss. I think that part really lowers the temperature of the conversation, helps both people engage in a very human way. So great advice there for folks. When you start to engage with somebody new, with a coaching engagement or a new organization or a new company, do you notice any commonalities with where the organization is at or where the leader is at professionally that might lead them to be open to and seeking out coaching? Is there anything that's just kind of like a commonality that you've noticed?
Well, I will say it's a really dynamic time in our industry for lots of exciting reasons, but also looking at the variance between, we've got our new graduates all the way up to our people who are getting ready to retire, and what each of those individuals and then everyone in between, the career path they were choosing at the time that they chose it is so different. Their expectations of what that career is going to be like for them are very different. So people getting ready to retire, we've got all of these opinions about how things are changing. Some of them good, a lot of them just changes and stressors and even some discomforts that come with that and what things used to be like and the freedoms we used to enjoy and the say we used to have in things, right? And so those types of components can come into play. And then others are welcoming all of the changes with open arms and are seeing and reaping the benefits of that. And so there's those things. And then you've got, like I said, everybody all the way down to the new graduates who have a totally different perspective. That was never what they were expecting. They're expecting the environment that we're currently in. They are aware of it, but sometimes with some different mindsets about work and what that's going to look like and what they want to put into it and what they hope to get out of it. And so when I'm looking at people who are good coaching candidates, if I'm consulting with an organization, the first thing I want to say is that, everybody's going to go through this emotional experience. And so there are three periods of time we want to be really aware of. The first is an onboarding. It takes about 150 days to get a doctor credentialed and through our onboarding process, and then like another 100 days before they're really productive in a meaningful way. But we don't actually have that long to make a strong first impression. It's really happening at the forefront when they're drinking from a fire hose and trying to figure out who's who and where's my stuff and where's the bathroom. We really need to be intentional about that initial process with people, because at the same time they're hearing from their friends, "Oh, you accepted a job there? I'm over here. Did you look over here?" And they're rethinking with every step of the way. They're rethinking, did I make the right decision? So we want to make sure that we are helping them know, yeah, you're absolutely in the right spot. We want you here. We want to support you. And there's lots that goes into that we can do to support them. The second period of time is anytime there's a promotion. I notice it's not quite as intense, but it's the same thing all over again. If somebody's going to partner with the organization, or we're going to go from regional to C-suite or anything like that, we're questioning those things again. Is this the right move for me? Do I want to make this level of investment or commitment with the organization? And then the third would be anytime there's a merger or acquisition, we want to make sure that we have, or any other major change, but those are some of the big ones. We want to make sure that we have supports in place, because people have a lot of opinions about it, and change management is a whole nother animal, but having the coaching in place to support people's thought processes around those difficult conversations, around success and failure, around time management and how they're thinking about their future and preparing for that. All of these things come into play. So those are the three times: onboarding, promotions, and major changes. Outside of that, I would say people who have been practicing for 10 years or more are really good candidates for this type of coaching, because they've got some things in place and are now feeling like they can take on something more. They've learned a lot of the things they need to learn to function in their career, and are now looking at developing, not just as a professional, but as a person.
You have a focus in mental health and wellness and avoiding burnout. What are some of the keys? What are the things to look out for, and what can be done to help prevent that?
So I think the organizations that are proactive, that put things in place and are really looking down the road saying, we don't ever want our doctors or team members to get there, that's going to be your healthiest approach, right? It's like going to the gym and eating healthy. We're putting those supports in place so that we don't have an issue. Sometimes I get a call and it's like, "Hey, Chelsea, the house is on fire. Can you fix everything?" And I'm like, well, maybe I can. And so it really comes down to, do we have, what are the organization's goals? Do we have the right key players in the organization? Because alternatively, what can happen is if we have a mismatch there, we put supports in place and everybody realizes this is not a match. And so the people leave.
So focusing on preventative care is definitely the preferred method of avoiding burnout. If once you already are having an organization that is really suffering from that, it becomes much more difficult to course correct at that point.
It does, but I will say that people, they're really forgiving. And so if the organization, let's say you're noticing like burnout left and right and you want to fix this problem, if the organization is transparent about that, like, hey, we recognize there's a lot of things going on in this organization, it's impacting people in a lot of ways, and we want to provide you a support, whether that's me or, your own internal thing or somebody else, let them know that you see them, let them know that you hear them, and people will probably give you a chance. They haven't left yet. That's a good sign. And people generally, that's all they want, right? They want to have experiences that they feel good about, that they want to have more of. And so when we provide that, then they want to stay and they feel good about trading their time, their awake hours for the feelings and outcomes that they have in our businesses.
I heard you mention, and maybe I read this somewhere, the comment, having leaders who coach in every position in an organization is what sets the most successful organizations apart or businesses apart. And that really resonates. And I think about coaching and leadership as opposed to just being a manager and what the differences there are. Why do you think that coaching is so difficult for people? And are there a few tactical pieces of advice that you would give to somebody that's looking to improve in that area?
One of the reasons it can be so difficult, and I'd be curious to know your input on this too, Mike, but I think one of the things that I'm seeing is it's kind of like when you become a parent for the first time, or an aunt or an uncle for the first time, depending on what type of support structure you had. So in this case, what type of coaching and mentorship you've been exposed to, that's what you're bringing to the table, right? You can't give anything that you don't yet have. So that's a big component. And then another component of it is just personality style. A lot of people don't want to be a coach or a mentor. That's not what they want to do. They want to do the thing that they're really good at doing, that they enjoy doing. And while they recognize that comes with being in a team environment, that's not really the thing that drew them to their career path. And so just recognizing that there's an area of opportunity there to maybe first coach that person or make sure they have supports in place. So as they're having these conversations, they don't come out, some of the most common complaints from team members are that they are led by people who are indirect or that they are unapproachable or that they're not very nice and not easy to work around or that they're unpredictable. Their moods are fluctuating. What are your thoughts on this subject?
I think that all of that is absolutely accurate. I think there's also a component of a fear of people not liking them. And so when you have leaders, especially if they're new to a leadership role, coaching often involves, always involves, highlighting areas where people can improve. And if you view it from a perspective of just pointing out the deficiencies and where people are falling short, versus approaching it from a positive perspective of how somebody can get better, which is a very kind of fine line and easy dynamic that is you can kind of go back and forth on. I think that people struggle when they're coaching members of their team in focusing on the positive, and they're worried that they're going to highlight things that make that person uncomfortable and not like them, because a lot of people, human nature is wanting to be liked. And really, it's a backwards way of thinking. But I think it's pervasive because when you coach somebody well, it actually strengthens that bond and it builds that connection and it helps increase the trust, and you're helping somebody be better at what they're doing, which is the ultimate focus of what you as a leader should be doing. But it's easy to think that, hey, I'm going to highlight something that they're struggling with this. And as a result, they're not really going to like it because people don't like to hear that they're not doing well. And I think that there's an avoidance that will take place in having some of those courageous conversations. So not all the time, but I think that's a piece that can play into maybe a little bit of avoidance that some folks run into when they need to be coaching and they're choosing not to.
You're so right. I was actually just coaching a doctor recently, and he was like, well, I don't really know what we were talking about his manager. And he was like, I don't really know what her issue is. If I haven't told her that she's doing something wrong, shouldn't she just assume she's doing everything right? And I was like, no, she shouldn't, because if the only time you talk to her is when she's doing something wrong, then she thinks those are the things that you notice. But I don't think that that's all that uncommon. I think people do think that way. Like, I can even find myself thinking that way if I'm going so fast. You need to be conscious about taking the time to say something. If, notice the things that people around you are doing that are right. And it's kind of cool too. It's like a mind hack. As soon as you notice one thing that's going right, you start noticing, you're like, oh, and I guess that's in place too. And that looks pretty good. It's really a good momentum to start getting behind. But, the other thing that came to mind is Brene Brown's teachings about vulnerability and honesty, and how when we withhold things like that from people, if there's an area of opportunity that we withhold, it's actually not kind at all. And many people are hoping to be better people every single day. They're working on whatever they're working on personally and professionally. And we may know those goals and we may not, but they are hoping to improve. And so by giving them the benefit of the doubt and demonstrating our faith in them, it's almost like an indirect way of saying, hey, I recognize that you're a person who can grow and would want to grow. So here's something I'm noticing that would actually make your life and then the team's functionality better. Can we talk about this thing? If we could say it with that sort of essence, I think that it would dismantle some of the fear going into those conversations.
Yeah, that's really well said. We read Dare to Lead as one of our book club books in our revenue team last year. And so, it is interesting. You think you're being kind, but you're not. And that's, I think, an interesting framework for people to put things through. One of the other areas that I think is a big challenge is when somebody has a lack of self-awareness. And self-awareness is challenging for all of us, right? And the perspective that other people have of us is obviously going to be different than how we think about ourselves. But I think a lot of those that are really strong leaders that move into high levels of different organizations, part of the reason why they're able to do that is because they have that self-awareness. But when you're working with people in an office or a practice or an organization, and there's that disconnect, is there an approach that you take that you've had success with to help them become more self-aware?
Yeah, what's so interesting? So feeling work is deep and uncomfortable for some people, but it's so impactful. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is that everybody that I work with, I put them all very intelligent individuals, right? But there's a large portion of them that when we start talking about feelings and just like, hey, how are you feeling right now? Or how are you feeling about that? They're like, I don't know. They can pretty much identify if it's good or bad. And it's not that they don't actually know what they're thinking and feeling, it's more not checking in with themselves to find out how they're thinking and feeling. And so what can happen is we've got all of these plates spinning in the air. And if we're not checking in with ourselves first to determine how we're feeling, we can sometimes misjudge whether or not it's the right approach that we're taking with someone or the right timing to handle a situation. So just helping people to understand, the importance of checking in. Sometimes I'll even put it on a schedule, once an hour, just ask yourself, how am I feeling? And if at first, if it needs to be good or bad, just that's my identifier. Right? I'm either feeling good or I'm feeling bad. And then go from there, kind of dig in underneath that. Okay, so it's bad. So am I nervous? Am I fearful? Am I frustrated? Am I scared? What is the bad?
Do you ever break out the wheel of emotions and help people see that? I need that because I don't know what I'm feeling. The good and the bad, like you said, is I think the baseline metric that most people can identify with, but then taking it that level deeper and getting a true understanding. Is it like frustration? Is it an anger? Is it, what is it actually stemming from? It's actually really challenging and very hard to do.
We don't want to do that to the point where we're procrastinating moving forward, but just to kind of make it a little less frightening, because I think we're really good at freaking ourselves out when we want to.
Absolutely. With your career and all of the coaching that you've done, where do you go to learn? You mentioned Brene Brown, and you talked about you've been investing into a group that was an organization where you actually go and you work with other professionals, and you've got a conference that you're coming out. Can you share a little bit? Like, I imagine that in a coaching role like this, it's just so important to always be kind of, sharpening your tools and having new techniques. And I'd be curious what your approach to that is.
So I will always have a coach, at least one coach. I think it's just so important to have those alternative perspectives to continue challenging myself, developing myself, and expanding myself. That's really important. And then, actively reading, going to conferences, going to wherever I can to constantly seek I study this every single day. I think it's pretty obvious. I love what I do, and it's not work to me. This is just so exciting. It lights me up. It fuels my fire. So I just absolutely love it. But surrounding myself with really good individuals like yourself, people who are also trying to better themselves and make their mark on the world. Those are the types of people I want to be around. I find you probably have a similar experience, but I find that now that I know my purpose and I know what I'm here to do, I'm very selective about the energy that I'll put myself around, particularly for prolonged periods of time. It's not that anybody's energy is bad. I don't think there's bad and good. I just think what is aligned with me and where I'm going and who I'm being, that's very, very important. I have a purpose here, and so I need to be true to that.
Yeah, when you have that clarity, it allows you to be much more intentional about your approach to achieving what's really important for you and what aligns with your values. And there's the other old adage, you're the average of whatever the 5 people you spend the most time around. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. And I think it's something that I didn't put enough weight into earlier on in my life. But as I get older, you really recognize the importance of being protective of your time and spending that time with people that are filling you as you are filling them. And I think it's a really important thing that maybe some folks don't put enough thought into, but I agree completely. I want to talk about your podcast experience because podcasting is new for me. But before that, are there any podcasts that you listen to or that you would recommend?
Oh, I'd recommend this one. I kind of podcast hop a lot. Which ones do you recommend? I like everything from how I built this to this podcast to self-help type things. I'm not going to remember the name off the top of my head, but I came across this really great one. It's a mindfulness podcast. But what do you like?
For myself, I kind of podcast hop as well. I went through a phase where I just listened to Tim Ferriss like nonstop for almost like 2 years. And because I started way after he started his, and sometimes I can be obsessive about things. Sometimes it's a positive personality trait, sometimes not so positive. But I was like, started listening to him at like episode 1 when he already had like 250. And I was like, I'm just going to listen to them all. And I found them all very fascinating. So that was one. And then I kind of overdosed on podcasting on listening to them for a little bit. And so now it's driven more for me by if I see a guest that I think is really interesting or that I've been exposed to before and I want to learn more from. And so Tim Ferriss, I listen to this All In pod. It's a bunch of really wealthy dudes that are probably a little bit out of touch with reality, but talk about business. So I like that from like a business perspective. But yeah, I kind of go all over. I have started on the reading side. If I look at kind of the course of my professional growth, when I first started, I started in sales. So I read a bunch of sales books. It was all sales. Then I went to leadership and I read a bunch of leadership books. And now I read more books that talk about psychology and talk about the mind and cognitive dissonance and things like that. So it's kind of fascinating to reflect. I didn't realize it was happening at the time in that way. You can kind of look back and go like, oh, this almost like I knew the path I should be doing without doing it intentionally, which I guess I kind of lucked out on that. But I guess I'm all over the place.
I love the psychology books and the personal development side of ththings. It's really great mixed with some science because it all kind of works together.
So your podcast experience, you've had a podcast for a few years now. Mine's new. This is, I think, the 14th or 15th recording that I've done. It's been a lot of fun. Personally, it's been much more challenging than I anticipated it being. I would love to hear about your experience, like anything that surprised you about doing a podcast, any unexpected benefits or any challenges that, you've gone through that you didn't expect to have happen.
I love podcasting, and I would say that has been my most visual growth experience for everybody else because when I first started it, it was really robotic. I mean, just trying to get the word out there that the things that people are coming to me and talking about are not isolated, that these are human issues, not just an anomaly in that office or in that organization. That was my purpose, was just to help kind of unveil these topics and make them a little bit more approachable. And then I started having some people on who had been through some sort of journey so that people who are going through a journey know there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Oh, that person that I really respect had a growing experience also. And now it's kind of a mix of guests and then some of the stuff that I'm coaching on because I think that I'm told by, our audience really likes kind of a mix of both hearing from other people and then hearing also some of the coaching topics. But I really love getting to just interact with people and getting to know people. And it's not sponsored. I don't get paid for the podcast. I just really love doing it. And if it helps people on their way to and from work, then that's great.
The people are the best part. 100% I feel the same way. And having gotten the opportunity to meet cool people like yourself, it's really rewarding. And it's like, I hope we run into each other at some conference or event. And now it'll be like, hey, I know you. Let's talk. This is great. That part's been amazing. I think that it's funny. You mentioned people can actually witness your growth over time because you started in this little robotic and everything else. And going back to like imposter syndrome and self-doubt, all of that, every episode still for me. That's where I'm at still.
You're doing great. You're doing fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. But I get off every single one and I beat myself up and talk about like how it wasn't all that great and how it could have been better. And then the next one, I'm like, this one's going to be better. Sometimes now I get off. I like, this one feels good. I think we're doing all right. It's an interesting journey to go along. And you recognize, I think part of the stress or the challenge is you want to provide a great platform for your guests to really show, what they do and present themselves in a way that, they can really exhibit all the amazingness that they are. And it's like an obligation or responsibility that like you kind of own a little bit when you're the host of the podcast. Do you feel that? Do you kind of sense that when you're inviting people on your show?
For the guests, yeah, I feel it both for the guests and for the listeners because everybody's investing their time. I want to be conscious of that. And so I luckily have been given a lot of grace by my guests who, were just there with me when I was trying to figure it out. And I'm still trying to figure it out. But hopefully it's a really good time, as I said before, and hopefully it provides some value to people along the way. And we all have a good time in the process.
Well, I've had a good time in this process, and I really appreciate you taking the time and joining. Before we wrap up, where can people find you?
LinkedIn's the best. Chelsea Myers, Myers. We also have the website, dentallife.coach. Soon to have a website for the foundation, which is new this year, the Brain Crops Foundation, which is going to be providing services to those in need. And the podcast, Dental Brain Crops Podcast.
Awesome. And before we wrap, can you talk just a little bit more about the foundation? Tell us what that is all about.
We are making an incredible impact with the coaching services that we're offering through Dental Life Coach. Sometimes there are people, doctors, and or their family members who, for an extenuating circumstance, can't afford these types of services. I have one who's down one income while spouse is going through rehab. I have one who has a very severe health crisis. And so we want to make sure that those people also are supported. So we put a portion of our own profits into the foundation and then use those for those who need access to supports.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us, Chelsea. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciated getting to know you.
Thank you.
The Dental Economist Show is brought to you by Planet DDS. To find out more about how cloud-based dental software by Planet DDS helps unleash dentists and their staff to focus on patient care, visit www.planetdds.com. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes by following wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.